The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and the cold, metallic ozone of a coming storm. Dante stands like a silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling glass, his custom charcoal suit a stark contrast to the city lights bleeding below. He views his empire as a chessboard where every piece is predictable, until her. Just as he prepares to sign a death warrant for a rival, he sees the image on his desk. Elena. She is captured in a graining surveillance photo, still wearing that simple black vest and white shirt, balancing a tray of champagne, but her upward glance, raw and unafraid, hits him like a physical blow. For the first time in a decade, the Stone boss's calculating mind goes blank. He drops his mask of indifference, staring at the photo until the ink seems to burn, leaving the most feared man in the tri-state area suddenly and visibly unsettled. The street lamps were still flickering with a dying orange hum when Dante stepped out of the leather-scented silence of his armored SUV. It was 3:12 a.m. The air in the slums was thick with the scent of wet trash and cold concrete, a far cry from the gold-leafed ballroom where she first stole his breath. The rain in Brooklyn didn't fall. It clung to the skin like a cold, damp shroud. Dante sat in the back of the armored Maybach, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers the only sound cutting through the silence of the cabin. In his hand was a manila folder, the physical manifestation of his obsession. His investigators had spent 48 hours peeling back the layers of a life meant to stay buried, and what they found made the Stone boss tighten his grip until the paper crinkled. Elena Rossi. The name felt like a prayer and a curse on his tongue. She wasn't just a waitress who had been in the right place at the wrong time. She was the daughter of Lorenzo Rossi, a man who had once been a trusted accountant for the Gambino family before he vanished with $10 million of blood money. Elena wasn't just working double shifts for the tips. She was paying off a ghost's debt, one grueling hour at a time, while living in a walk-up that smelled of industrial exhaust and broken dreams. "She's coming out, boss," his driver, Marco, whispered. Dante looked through the tinted glass. There she was. The Gala's silk and champagne were gone, replaced by a thin, faded jacket and heavy boots. She looked smaller under the flickering orange hum of the street lamps, her shoulders hunched against the wind. But as she paused to help an elderly neighbor with a heavy bag of groceries, that same unforced, natural grace Dante had seen at the ballroom flickered to life. Even in the mud of the slums, she carried a light that didn't belong there. He watched her turn the corner into a dark alleyway, a shortcut he knew was infested with the very scavengers who were hunting her father's shadow. Dante didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the climate-controlled silence and into the grime of the real world. His Italian leather shoes hit the damp asphalt with a heavy, predatory thud. He followed her into the shadows, his presence a dark eclipse against the city's neon pulse. He saw them before she did, 3 men trailing her, their intentions written in the way they fanned out to corner her. The Stone boss felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, a protective rage he hadn't felt in a decade. "Elena," he called out. His voice wasn't a question, it was a command that stopped the world in its tracks. She spun around, her breath hitching in a puff of white mist. When her eyes met his, the fear of the thugs behind her was instantly replaced by a different kind of shock. She recognized him, the man from the Gala, the man who had ignored a room full of diamonds just to look at her. "The debt is settled," Dante said, stepping into the dim light of a dying street lamp. "But your life as a ghost ends tonight." The transition from the grime of the Brooklyn alleyway to the silent, suffocating luxury of the Blackwood Estate happened in a blur of motion and rain-slicked pavement. Elena sat pressed against the buttery leather of the SUV's backseat, her hands trembling in her lap. Beside her, Dante was a pillar of shadow, his profile sharp and unyielding against the passing city lights. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the cabin like a gathering storm, a silent promise that the world she knew, the world of double shifts and hiding from shadows, was gone forever. When the massive iron gates of the estate swung open, Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The tires crunched over white gravel, winding through acres of manicured gardens that looked more like a graveyard in the moonlight. Then, the house appeared, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass, glowing with a cold, amber light. "This isn't a home," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she looked up at the towering columns. "It's a prison." Dante stepped out and held the door for her, his hand steady as he offered it to her. "It's a fortress, Elena. There are people in this city who would trade your life for a fraction of what your father stole. Here, they can't reach you." He led her through the grand foyer, where the air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and expensive floor wax. Her scuffed boots felt like a sacrilege against the polished marble. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of his power, priceless paintings, silent security details standing like statues in the corners, and the oppressive weight of a history written in blood. He stopped at the base of a sweeping spiral staircase and turned to face her. The harsh overhead lights caught the gold in his eyes, making them look predatory yet strangely weary. "You'll have everything you need: clothes, food, protection, but you do not leave these grounds without my express permission. Is that understood?" Elena looked up, her shy exterior momentarily hardening. "You say it's for my safety, but I've spent my whole life being told where to go by men who think they own me. How are you any different, Dante?" For a moment, the stone boss faltered. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt dangerously out of place in such a cold house. The touch sent a jolt through her, a heat that defied the clinical silence of the room. "The difference," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "is that I'm the only one who will kill to keep you breathing. Welcome to the cage, Elena. Try not to break your wings against the bars." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the vast, hollow hall, a girl in a stained vest, lost in a palace of shadows. The sunlight that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast room was as sharp as a blade, illuminating every flaw Elena felt she possessed. Dante had insisted she join the morning briefing, a gathering of his most trusted associates and their wives, under the guise of integrating her into the household. But as she stood in a borrowed silk dress that felt like a foreign skin, she realized she hadn't been invited to a meal. She had been thrown into a shark tank. At the long mahogany table sat 3 women who looked like they had stepped directly off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. Their skin was poreless, their jewelry whispered of old money, and their eyes, as they landed on Elena, were filled with a cold, calculated disdain. "So, this is the little stray Dante picked up from the gutter." The voice belonged to Bianca, a woman whose beauty was as jagged as a broken diamond. She swirled a crystal flute of mimosa, her gaze raking over Elena's nervous posture. "I heard he found you carrying a tray of half-empty glasses. Tell me, darling, did you think a spill of champagne on a tuxedo would lead to a wedding ring, or are you just better at serving than the rest of us?" The room went silent, the clinking of silverware ceasing as the men watched the sport. Elena felt the familiar urge to look at her feet, to apologize for existing, to shrink back into the shadows of the kitchen where she belonged. She could feel Dante's eyes on her from the head of the table, intense, unblinking, waiting to see if his lamb would be devoured. "I wasn't looking for a ring, Bianca," Elena said, her voice small but surprisingly steady. She looked up, meeting the socialite's icy stare. "I was looking for a way to survive. I imagine that's a concept you've never had to learn, considering your biggest struggle seems to be the weight of your necklaces." A sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. Bianca's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "You little—" "Enough!" Dante's voice didn't rise, but the single word carried the weight of a falling guillotine. He didn't look at Bianca. His gaze was fixed solely on Elena, a ghost of a dark, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Elena is a guest of this house. If any of you find her presence beneath you, you are more than welcome to find the exit. I hear the streets she came from are quite educational this time of year." The silence that followed was heavy with humiliation. The supermodels suddenly found great interest in their plates, their power stripped away by a single sentence from the boss. Elena realized then that the stone boss didn't just protect her with walls and guns, he protected her with his shadow. But as she caught the murderous glint in Bianca's eyes, she knew the plain Jane, waitress, had just traded one type of predator for another. The clock in the grand hallway chimed 2:00 a.m., the sound echoing like a heartbeat through the silent estate. Elena couldn't sleep. The silk sheets felt too smooth, the room too large, and the weight of the day's confrontation with Bianca too heavy. Driven by a restless hunger for something familiar, she navigated the darkened corridors toward the library, hopping to find a book to anchor her racing mind. She stopped at the threshold. The room was bathed in the low, amber glow of a dying fire. Dante was there, slumped in a heavy leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid sweating on the table beside him. His tie was undone, his sleeves rolled up, and for the first time, the stone boss looked less like a monument and more like a man. "The shadows in this house have a way of talking back, Elena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't turn to look at her, but she knew he had sensed her arrival the moment she stepped onto the rug. "What are they saying to you tonight?" "That I don't belong here," she whispered, stepping closer to the hearth. "That I'm just a guest in a war zone." Dante finally looked up, and in the firelight, the mask he wore for the world was gone. He reached out, not to touch her, but to unbutton his shirt further, pulling the collar back to reveal a jagged silver line of scar tissue that ran from his collarbone toward his heart. Then, he turned his forearm, showing a burn mark shaped like a jagged star. "Every one of these is a story of belonging," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "This one was from my father, to remind me that loyalty is earned through pain. This one was from a brother who thought he could take my place. People look at me and see a monster of stone, but I am just a collection of healed wounds." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the scar on his chest. The air between them hummed with a sudden, electric vulnerability. "Is that why you brought me here? To see if I could be another scar?" "No," Dante breathed, his hand finally reaching out to cover hers, pressing her palm flat against the heat of his skin, right over his steady, thundering heart. "I brought you here because you're the only thing I've touched in 10 years that didn't feel like it was made of ice. The world thinks you're a plain Jane, Elena, but to me, you're the only thing that's real." In that quiet, flickering room, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't the captor and she wasn't the prey. They were just two ghosts seeking warmth in a house built on secrets. As the fire turned to ash, Elena realized that the stone boss wasn't hiding his heart from the world. He was hiding it for her. The morning sun was a cold, pale light that offered no warmth as Elena stepped back into her bedroom. The previous night's intimacy with Dante still hummed in her veins, the heat of his skin against her palm, the raw honesty of his scars, and for a fleeting moment, the gilded cage had felt like a sanctuary. But as she approached the heavy oak vanity, the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. There, resting dead center on her white lace runner, was a single red lily. Its petals were so vibrant they looked like fresh blood against the pale fabric. Elena froze, her breath hitching in her throat. This wasn't a gift. In the underworld Dante lived in, flowers weren't for romance, they were for funerals. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and saw a small, cream-colored card tucked beneath the stem. "The stone boss can't protect a ghost," the elegant script read. "Eventually, everyone joins their father." The room suddenly felt too small, the high ceilings pressing down on her like the lid of a casket. She backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the heart of the Blackwood Estate, a fortress guarded by men with automatic weapons and high-tech surveillance. If someone could leave a flower on her vanity, they could have just as easily left a knife in her throat while she slept. "Dante," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper before she found her strength and screamed his name. The door burst open seconds later. Dante was there, his jacket off, his holster visible against his white shirt. His eyes scanned the room with predatory efficiency before landing on the vanity. He didn't need to read the card. The sight of the red lily turned his expression into something ancient and terrifying. The stone boss was back, his features hardening into a mask of cold, murderous fury. He walked to the vanity, picking up the flower and crushing it in his fist until the red juice stained his palm. "Marco!" he roared, and the hallway filled with the sound of running boots. Elena watched him, her vision blurring. The piece of the library was gone, shattered by a single blossom. She realized then that she hadn't escaped her past. She had simply brought it into a much larger, much deadlier arena. Dante turned to her, his eyes blazing with a mix of rage and a desperation he couldn't quite hide. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm, grounding her. "The walls aren't high enough," he hissed, more to himself than to her. "They think they found a weakness. They think you're a lamb I brought home to slaughter." He pulled her into his chest, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder enveloping her. "They're wrong, Elena. They didn't find a weakness. They found the reason I'm going to burn this city to the ground." But as she clung to him, Elena looked at the crushed red petals on the floor and knew the truth. The warning wasn't just for Dante. It was a promise to her. The shy waitress was no longer invisible. She was the target in a war she didn't know how to fight. The basement of the Blackwood Estate didn't smell like sandalwood or expensive lilies. It smelled of cold oil, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of reality. Down here, beneath the marble and the silk, was the engine that kept Dante's empire running. He stood in the center of the private shooting range, his silhouette cast long and jagged against the soundproofed walls. "In the ballroom, you survived by being invisible," Dante said, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp that vibrated in the small space. "But now they've seen you. You can't go back to the shadows, Elena, so you have to become the shadow." He stepped behind her, his chest a wall of solid heat against her back. He reached around, his large, scarred hands covering her smaller ones as he guided her to pick up a weighted practice blade. The contrast was startling. His skin was toughened by a decade of violence. Hers still carried the softness of someone who had only ever handled crystal and linen. "A viper doesn't strike because it's angry," he whispered against the shell of her ear, his breath hitching slightly as he felt her shiver. "It strikes because it's calculated. If you look at the floor, you're dead. If you hesitate, you're dead. You look them in the eye, you find the gap in their armor, and you don't stop until the threat is gone." He moved her through the motions, a pivot of the hips, a sharp upward thrust, a parry that utilized her smaller frame to unbalance a larger opponent. Every time she faltered, he reset her with a firm, grounding touch. It was a dance of lethal grace, a communion of predator and protege. "I don't want to be a killer, Dante," Elena breathed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dante spun her around, his grip on her shoulders tightening just enough to make her look up. The stone boss was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes burned with a desperate, protective fire. "I don't want you to be a killer either. I want you to be a survivor. Because the moment I'm not in the room, these vipers will look at your kindness and see an invitation. I'm teaching you how to decline." He reached into the pocket of his tactical vest and pulled out a small, obsidian-handled stiletto. It was beautiful, understated, and terrifyingly sharp. He tucked it into a hidden sheath he had sewn into the waistband of her skirt. "Keep the shy smile. Keep the downward glance," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw one last time before the mask of the boss clicked back into place. "Let them think you're the lamb. It's the last mistake they'll ever make." As they walked back up toward the light of the main house, Elena felt the weight of the steel against her hip. She was still the shy waitress, but for the first time, she wasn't just waiting for the blow to fall. She was ready to catch it. The air in the private club was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, electric tension of a ceasefire that was already fraying at the edges. This was the Peace Summit, a gathering of the city's most dangerous men, held in a room where the gold leaf on the walls couldn't hide the bloodstains on the history of the families present. Dante sat at the head of the long table, his expression a mask of bored granite, but his hand never strayed far from the glass of scotch on the table, or the woman standing just behind his right shoulder. Elena wore a dress of midnight silk, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She looked exactly like what they expected, a beautiful trophy, silent and ornamental. But beneath the silk, the stiletto Dante had given her pressed against her thigh, a cold reminder of the secret she now carried. At the far end of the table, Don Morty, a man whose smile was as sharp and insincere as a razor, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Elena with a predatory glint. The room went silent, the clinking of ice against glass the only sound as the other capos waited for the opening move. "A lovely addition to the Dacre, Dante," Morty drawled, his voice a sandpaper rasp that made Elena's skin crawl. "But we all heard about the gala. The stone boss, ignoring the finest pedigree in the city for a girl who smells of dishwater and cheap tips. It's a bad look. It suggests a man who has lost his appetite for power and developed a taste for charity." Dante didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Morty. He simply swirled his drink, the amber liquid catching the light. "My tastes are my own, Morty, and my charity usually involves a shallow grave for those who overstep." Morty laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He stood up, walking slowly toward Dante's end of the table. "Is that so? Because word on the street is that she's your Achilles' heel, a shy little bird who wouldn't know what to do with a wolf if he bit her." He stopped just inches from Elena, his breath smelling of stale wine. He reached out a hand, intending to mockingly stroke her cheek. "Tell me, sweetheart, does he let you sit at the big table, or are you just here to make sure our glasses stay full?" The room held its breath. Elena felt the familiar urge to look at the floor, to shrink away from the monster in front of her. But then she felt Dante's presence behind her, not as a shield, but as a mountain. She remembered the basement. She remembered the weight of the steel. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She looked Morty directly in the eye, her gaze as cold and unwavering as Dante's. "The boss doesn't need me to fill your glass, Don Morty," she said. Her voice a calm, lethal chime that cut through the tension. "He brought me here to see which of his guests doesn't know when to keep their hands to themselves." The silence that followed was deafening. Morty's hand froze in midair, his smug expression flickering into a mask of pure, murderous shock. Dante finally looked up, a dark, dangerous pride burning in his gold-flecked eyes. The stone boss wasn't protecting a lamb anymore. He was standing beside a queen. The air in the private club, already strained by Elena's defiance, suddenly curdled. It wasn't a sound that gave it away, but a silence. The way the seasoned waitstaff vanished into the shadows, and the hum of the air conditioning seemed to cut out, leaving only the heavy thud of Elena's heart. She scanned the room, her eyes no longer drifting to the floor but tracking the movement of a man in the far corner. He wasn't reaching for a bottle of vintage wine. His hand was sliding beneath the white linen of a serving station. "Dante," she breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. Before the stone boss could even turn, the first shot shattered a crystal chandelier, raining diamonds of glass upon the mahogany table. The room erupted into a symphony of chaos, overturned chairs, the roar of automatic gunfire, and the panicked shouts of men who had come for peace but brought a war. Dante lunged for her, his large frame intended to be her shield, but Elena was already moving. She didn't shrink. She remembered the basement. She remembered the pivot. As a second gunman emerged from the kitchen, aiming directly at the back of Dante's head, Elena didn't scream. She reached into the silk of her skirt, her fingers finding the mother-of-pearl handle of the stiletto. In one fluid motion, she kicked a heavy silver ice bucket off the table. It crashed into the gunman's shins, throwing his aim off by a fraction of an inch as his bullet hissed past Dante's ear. Before he could recover, Elena was on him. She didn't strike like a brawler. She moved like the invisible girl she had spent years being. She stepped into his blind spot and drove the small blade into the soft meat of his forearm. The man howled, dropping his weapon. Dante, realizing the shift in the wind, spun with a predatory snarl, his own suppressed pistol barking twice. The threat was neutralized before the body hit the floor. Dante grabbed Elena, pulling her behind a heavy marble pillar as his security detail returned fire. Blood splattered the hem of her midnight silk dress, a grim embroidery she hadn't asked for. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his eyes searching hers for the shy waitress he had met at the gala. He didn't find her. He found a woman whose hands were steady even as the world burned around them. "You saved me," he rasped, the shock momentarily cracking his stone mask. "You saw him before I did." "I spent my life watching for predators, Dante," she replied, her voice low and serrated. "I just finally stopped running from them." The ambush was failing, the rival families retreating into the night, but the message was clear. The stone boss wasn't vulnerable because of Elena. He was more dangerous than ever because he was no longer fighting alone. The morning after the blood and silk of the summit, the Blackwood Estate didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a throne room. The air was crisp, scrubbed clean by a dawn that found the stone boss standing at the head of the grand staircase, his hand resting not on a weapon, but on the small of Elena's back. Below them, the foyer was packed with the heavy hitters of the underworld, capos, soldiers, and the wives who had once whispered waitress like a slur. Dante didn't need a microphone. His voice, a low and lethal rumble, carried to every corner of the marble hall. "Yesterday, a coward thought he could find a weakness in this house," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until men twice Elena's size looked away. "He thought he could strike at the woman beside me because she didn't carry a name they feared. He was wrong. He didn't find a victim. He found the only person in this city brave enough to save my life while the rest of you were diving for cover." He turned to Elena, and for a split second, the cold granite of his expression softened into something resembling worship. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, not a delicate diamond for a socialite, but a heavy signet ring of black onyx and gold, the ancient seal of the Blackwood lineage. He slid it onto her finger, the weight of it a permanent anchor to his world. "From this breath forward," Dante announced, his voice rising like a storm, "Elena Rossi is not a guest. She is not a waitress. She is the shadow and the light of this empire. Touch her, and you challenge me. Look at her with anything less than absolute respect, and you'll find out why they call me the Stone Boss." A heavy, respectful silence followed, broken only by the synchronized bowing of his lead security detail. Elena stood tall, her chin level, her shoulders square. She looked down at the onyx ring, then back up at the sea of faces that had once terrified her. She saw Bianca in the corner, her face pale and her eyes downcast. She saw the men who had mocked her father's name now standing at attention. The shy waitress who had lived her life in the periphery, terrified of her own shadow, was gone. Elena didn't look at the floor. She didn't seek the safety of the dark. She looked directly into the sun of her new reality, her hand tightening around Dante. "I spent my life hiding," she whispered, her voice carrying a new, razor-edged clarity that silenced the room. "But today, I stop running. If you want a war, you'll find it here. If you want peace, you'll find it through me." Dante led her down the stairs, and for the first time, the crowd parted not out of fear of the man, but out of reverence for the woman. The gilded cage had been torn down, and in its place stood a palace. The transformation was complete. The shy waitress had looked up, and the world had finally blinked.